Well, here we are, session number 63. The title, A Test. We're looking at Mark 12, verses 13 through 17. Jesus had just finished with those who challenged his authority. If you recall, they were mainly chief priests, scribes, elders, those from the Sanhedrin, even perhaps the leadership of the Sanhedrin. They had made efforts to discredit Jesus or diminish, there it goes again. His popularity continued with two more questions up and coming. Actually, I think there'd be three more questions up and coming from different conspiring groups. And we'll talk about those as we get to them. By the way, I think I forgot to mention a couple of things from the previous session where we were talking about their efforts to diminish Jesus in his popularity by challenging his authority, his right to do the things that he was doing, and in particular the cleansing of the temple, which was going to cost most of them some income. In the parable that Jesus told about the landowner and the tenants who were trying to rob him of all of that stuff, that there were several instances where the owner sent servants before sending his son. Well, according to most interpreters, those servants, of course, were the prophets of old, the Old Testament prophets who were sent to tell people how to tend the vineyard Israel properly. There also were several references that are related to it, and if you care to look them up, one of them is Acts 4, verses 11 and 12, where Peter is discussing something like authority and so forth. And then also in 1 Peter 2, verses 4 to 8, there's another section in there that relates to something very similar to our last session. 2 Peter is interesting because chapter 2 of 2 Peter, which is where I just gave you a reference to, is essentially the same as the book of Jude. And that's another whole study that we have undertaken in the past. You want to go look up the book of Jude and the study of the book of Jude, enjoy. It is an interesting book, and it was a book given to warn believers in Jude's day and Jesus' days, the first years up to AD 100 at least, to give them some indication of what they could expect, from whom they could expect, and how to understand who these heretics, in fact, were. Well, let's go to the next coalition that's in line, and it's the Pharisees and the Herodians. We've seen them before in Mark, I think it's chapter 3. They were political opposites. The Pharisees hated Roman domination. The Herodians sought how to better cooperate with the Romans in managing the state of Israel. So politically they were opposites, but they joined in their opposition to Jesus. So they were opposed to Jesus as a single unity or entity. Mark had introduced him earlier, as I said. Let me read Mark 3:6 for you. And the Pharisees went out and immediately began taking counsel with the Herodians against him, Jesus, as to how they might destroy him. There were two thoughts about destroying him. One is to kill him, which is eventually where they ended up, of course. But the other was to destroy him insofar as his popularity and influence continued, because they were afraid that things were going to get haywire very quickly with the Romans if Jesus continued in his popularity. Now, Matthew gives us an introduction to this same question-centered event. Let me read from Matthew 22, verses 15 and 16, at least part of verse 16. So Matthew 22, 15 and 16. Then the Pharisees went and counseled together how they might trap him in what he said. They wanted it to be something that people would understand about their trap. And then they sent their disciples to him. That is, the Pharisees sent their own Pharisee brothers to Jesus along with the Herodians. So the Pharisees had pretty much made up their own mind, and they thought, well, let's get some help from another group, because between the religious opposites, or actually political opposites, between the Pharisees and the Herodians, they would be able to trap him into picking one of those two sides and cutting his popularity in half. You see that in several of these instances. But remember, Jesus was not afraid to go into these testing situations. He knew how to handle them. Luke gives us even a bit more. I'm going to look at Luke 20:20. And and he's talking here about scribes, chief priests, elders. He says, and they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be righteous. That's always, they have to be very careful that they're not seen as trying to get to Jesus, but that they have some righteous purpose in what they're doing. They sent spies who pretended to be righteous in order that they might catch him, Jesus, in some statement so as to deliver him up to the rule and the authority of the governor. So what does Luke tell us? They want to get Jesus in trouble with Pilate. They want Jesus to be an enemy of Rome in Romans' eyes. And so that's part of their strategy too, is trying to set him up where Rome will take him out. Because if they send him to the governor, the purpose is his execution. So the goal of the group was to find a charge they could make that would send Jesus under arrest to the Roman governor, preferably by a charge leading to capital punishment, as if he were an insurrectionist. They want Jesus to look like he's stirring up trouble against Rome. So let's go back to Mark now, verse 13 of chapter 12, where we begin. It says, and they sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians to him in order to trap him in a statement, just what we said previously. Two reasons. One is to get Rome ticked off at him if they can, and get him arrested and sent to Pilate, hopefully for his execution. Or at least they wanted to divide his following. They want to take those over whom he was showing influence and cut them way down, maybe in half. None of the three give any kind of timing mark, so we don't know exactly when the event we're going to talk about took place. Many scholars believe it was on Wednesday, only 2 days before Passover, which would come at 6 o'clock on Friday or so forth. So, but we don't know fully. The place within the temple, where they were in the temple when this took place, also isn't given. Was it the court of the Gentiles? Could have been. That's the most open segment of the temple. Or the court of women, which would exclude Gentiles but would include anyone else, any Jew. Or something else. We don't know. Maybe it was even in the portico, which was the outside area, the area outside the court of the Gentiles, a sort of walk area. We don't really know where he was. It doesn't seem that that's of particular importance in this case. But we're going to see later that their question, they hoped, would make it look like Jesus sided either with the zealots, which of course would get him executed, or with the Herodians, so that most of the people, the Jewish people, would not want to continue following him. So that was their case. And of course they've got both. They don't have zealots, supposedly, but they have Pharisees who are the religious zealots, even though most Pharisees were not going to try and overrun Rome and boot Rome out of the nation. But siding with zealots would put the Romans on his tail. Siding with the Herodians would shift Jewish support away from him. So if they were successful in either case, they would have diminished his influence. So they thought. So they begin with an attempt at gross flattery, calling him teacher to butter him up so that he would be off guard for what followed. But we know Jesus typically is never off guard. Excuse me. And they came and said to him, that's the coalition of Pharisees and Herodians, and they came and said to him, Teacher, we know that you are truthful. This is part of the flattery. And you defer to no one, for you are not partial to anyone. More flattery. But teach the way of God in truth. Ultimate flattery from their point of view. Here's the question. Is it lawful to pay a poll tax, which means is simply a head tax? Every person has to pay this tax. Is it lawful to pay a poll tax to Caesar or not? Lawful in what sense? Certainly it would be lawful according to Jewish law. To Roman law, because it's a Roman tax. If you don't pay it, you're in trouble with Rome. And then they continue to say, shall we pay or shall we not pay? So where does the law come in? What there really was saying is it according to God's way to pay the poll tax to Caesar, or would God object? Would you be considered righteous if you pay the poll tax? Would you be considered a sinner if you paid the poll tax? Which is it? Well, part of the goal, again, of the flattery was to force Jesus to answer their question, which he will. But they were hoping with a simple yes or no response. Well, they didn't get a simple yes or no. Again, the question of lawfulness really put the question in the form, is it lawful in God's law, or is it lawful under God's law to pay a poll or head tax into Caesar's coffers? Because that's where these things went. They went into the treasure under the control of the Caesar. Is God okay with that or not? The poll tax was instituted originally, as I understand, about AD 6 which would have been approximately at Christ's birth, because Christ was probably born. This would be about 10 years after his birth, because he probably was born around BC 4. So this would have started somewhere when Jesus was probably about 8, 10, 12 years of age. And it was a head tax on every person, and it went directly into Caesar's coffers. He was the one collecting the money. And there were some other problems with it, of course, and excuse me, we'll get to that. In Israel, there were 3 general attitudes toward the payment of this tax, which was a form of submission to Rome and to Caesar's rule. If Caesar says you're going to pay this tax and you do, you are giving in to the demands of Caesar. So you're submitting to Caesar. And remember, the Caesars were considered divine. They were considered gods. Well, about the different people. Zealots refused to bow, to submit, or to pay. They wanted revolt. We have one in the 12, it was called, remember, Simon the Zealot. There's some question of how he fit into this don't bow, don't submit, don't pay category. We have almost no information about Simon the Zealot. The Pharisees objected to the tax, but for expedience did not fight it. They paid it. The Pharisees paid the tax. Why? Because they considered it, how am I going to say this? One of two ways. Either a righteous thing to obey the law, regardless of whose law it was, or it was simply expedient, because it kept the Romans off your back, and you could continue to do what, as a Pharisee, you did. The Herodians supported foreign rule so long as a Herod was the ruling agent. And remember, we had after Herod the Great's death, we had 4 of Herod's sons who were ruling agents, all with Rome's approval. And the Herodians, favored paying the tax. So we had three groups. One says no, one says I don't like it, but, and the other said, let's go, let's pay it. All three groups were found in Israel. I do not know how large a group the Zealots were. Probably the smallest of the three. It'd be between the Herodians and the Zealots, I would assume, as to which was the smaller. The ones that said, I don't like it, but I'll pay it because otherwise, yeah. So the middle group that sided with the Pharisees probably would have been the largest. If Jesus answered no, the Romans would have seen him as a rabble-rouser and an enemy of Rome, an insurrectionist, as we said earlier. Either way, Jesus' influence would have been reduced, even if he himself was not eliminated by execution. So either the bulk of the Jewish people would be suddenly opposed to him if he says yes, simple yes, and otherwise he's either going to be with the group that favored Rome, like the Herodians, or favored revolt, like the other guys, the Zealots. But remember again, Jesus is not a novice when it comes to dealing with the ploys of those groups trying to trip him up and get him in big trouble. Let's look at the last half of verse 15 in Mark 12. But he, Jesus, knowing their hypocrisy, he knew they didn't. This wasn't how do I want to say? This is not a truly scriptural or truly religious or truly spiritual matter. They were hypocrites. And so he says, why are you testing me? Bring me a denarius to look at. So notice he has not said either yes or no. Matthew made the hypocrisy a bit more straightforward, more in your face. Look at what Matthew says Jesus did in response. Matthew 22:18. And this is the way I see Jesus in most of these situations. But Jesus perceived their malice and said, why are you testing me, you hypocrites? So Matthew says Jesus called them hypocrites to their face, much like J.B. John the Baptist did when he called them snakes, serpents, whatever. We've often heard of the denarius. It's a coin that represented a day's wage for the normal working man. But what most of us probably don't realize is that the denarius is a Roman coin, not a Jewish coin. It's a small silver Roman coin. That becomes quite clear in just a minute. What Jesus was doing by asking for a denarius was he wanted a visual aid to help make his point, so that no one misunderstood what he was saying, even though they did misunderstand what he was saying. He would have known that the Pharisees would likely not have a denarius on them. Why? Because it's a Roman coin. But he also figured, I'm sure, that the Herodians would have a Roman coin on them. Again, it's a Roman coin, not a Jewish coin, a small silver coin. And what was it used for? Well, one of the reasons it was used, because it was used to pay the poll tax. Not only was used, had to be used. You remember where a different coin had to be used? The denarius could not be used to pay the temple tax. Remember what was required? The Jewish half shekel. That's why there were money changers in the court of the Gentiles when Jesus cleaned it out. They were trading half shekels for denarius, or however it matched. I don't know what the exchange rate was, but it was costly. The people making the switches and the trades were making out like bandits. And effectively, that's what Jesus had called them, right? But the denarius had to be used to pay that poll tax. It included on it, and we're going to see that in a minute, on one side is an image of probably the current Caesar, although coins lasted longer than the Caesars probably. So there would have been some, but it would have been some Caesar on one side declaring some relation to divinity, like calling the Caesar's father God or something. And on the other side of the coin was words that declared Pontifex Maximus. It's about as little Latin as I can get. Pontifex Maximus. Maximus means top, right? It is Pontifex Maximus, meaning chief priest. So of the Roman religion, whatever it was, and there were many different forms of it, Caesar was declared to be a son of a god and a chief priest. Does that sound familiar? The image in the words portraying Caesar as God would have been idolatrous in the eyes of the Jews. Right? So that's why you couldn't use the denarius, for example, or any Roman coin to pay the temple tax, because it was an idolatrous element. Think what a coin means. If you use the coin, you are agreeing to be subject to the government that produced the coin and the ruler of the government. So if you used a denarius for anything, you were submitting to the law of Rome. But Israel was not to have a foreign ruler to whom they must live in submission. Let's go back into the Old Testament and look at Deuteronomy 17. Just a couple verses, 14 and 15. You can go something like this. When you enter the land, that would be Canaan, which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it, and you live in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like all of the nations. God knew they were going to demand a king. I will set a king over me like all the nations who are around me. That's what he says this nation of Israel, who are to be his people, will eventually come around to. And they did through the book of Judges and so forth. You shall surely set a king. Actually, I think the kingship waited until the history book of Samuel? 1 Samuel? You shall surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses. And he said, yeah, you're going to want a king, but you're not going to choose him. I'll choose him. Who will I choose? One from among your countrymen, which was something that Moses indicated. Of course, this is Moses telling the people God's words. You shall set as a king over you yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not your countryman. So what was God saying? You are never to be submissive to a pagan or other man or system. So the legality of paying the poll tax depended upon whether it was okay according to God. Look at Mark 12:16. Almost stopped at 6. Mark 12:16. And they brought one denarius, of course, and he said to them, whose likeness and inscription is this? So he said, whose picture is it, and who do the words relate to? And they said to him, the Pharisees and the Herodians, Caesar's. The use of the denarius then put the people under Roman rule, with God-ordained behavior constraints. Roman government was to be obeyed to whatever extent God decreed. Roman government was to be obeyed to whatever extent God decreed. But notice when it came to the temple, denarius or any Roman coin was not accepted. So in a sense, the Jews were supposed to have stayed with a shekel, a half shekel, their own coins. Caesar had a legitimate claim to some level of authority. That's why they have to obey according to what God allows. But Caesar's authority is not authority as a god. God, too, has a higher, better, stronger claim to authority over his people. So, does Caesar have some authority because they're ruling? Yes. Does that authority extend to anything that gets between the people and God? No. His authority stops where God's authority commences. And actually, God's authority is everywhere at all times. So some things God permits under Roman authority, some things he does not. Let's look at verse 17. Throat has one of those days again. And Jesus said to them, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Now let me read that, how it probably should have been translated. Pay back to Caesar the things that belong to Caesar. And to God, pay back to God the things that belong to God. So what does Jesus say? Whatever you're going to do with respect to the tax has to be, do you have an obligation to Caesar because he is ruler? Answer, yes. Does that authority continue unabated? No, because God has decrees on some things you will not do that Rome would expect you to do. One is to worship Caesar. So, Jesus' answer wasn't a yes-no answer, but one that got him out from the dilemma posed by the questioners, because he has just said the things that rightly belong to Caesar. If that tax is one of them, you're going to pay it. If that tax is out of God's decree, out of God's will, out of God's plan, no, you're not going to pay it. So he did not give a yes or no answer. He gives an answer that says maybe. The term render, as I said, is better translated pay back, which implies what? If you owe something, that's a debt. And so if Rome is in rule over you, there are some things you are indebted to the rulers for. So, using the coin of the Roman government implied a debt to be submissive to the laws of Rome, including the poll tax. So, in a sense, Jesus said yes, but it's under this condition, and there's going to be a point you don't use it in the temple, as I said, because God said, no, it's the half shekel. So God, not half shekel equivalent, it's the half shekel. But God has authority that Caesar does not have, and that implies a debt of obedience to God. Caesar has only that authority God ordained for human government. And you can have a whole study on the Christian's relationship to human government. You're knowing that Paul taught that all human government is part of God's plan, but not all human governments operate according to God's plan. There then comes the problem. Again, when authorities clash, God's authority trumps. No pun intended there. For instance, Caesar has no authority requiring he be worshipped. Worship belongs to God alone. Jesus recognized that both Caesar and God had claims, and the only conflict would come when both claimed the same authority. And Jesus said in that case, God's authority trumped Caesar's. Luke tells us that most of the Jesus' adversaries either misunderstood what he taught or intentionally distorted it. Let's look at Luke 23, verse 2. Luke 23:2. And they began to accuse him, that's Jesus, before Pilate. So Jesus is standing before Pilate, and they began to accuse him. This was high priests and other Jews, saying, we found this man misleading our nation. Remember, they claimed they had a legitimate trial of Jesus. And we found him forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar. Well, he didn't. He said, if God says it, then it's okay. He didn't say, don't pay the tax. And saying that he himself is Christ, a king. And that latter, while not said very often, was true. Jesus was the Messiah to be the ruling king. But the response when they heard this response on taxes, Mark 17, the last part of Mark 17, they were amazed at him. They realized they'd been had. That Jesus did not give them a yes-no answer. They couldn't tell certain people, look what he said and done. Another group, look at what he said and done. They couldn't do that because of his answer. Look at Luke 20:26. And they, that's the Pharisees and Herodians, were unable to catch him in a saying in the presence of the people. This was in the temple, so there were crowds of people other than the Pharisees and the Herodians. Remember, This was a couple days before Passover, so there were tens of thousands of pilgrims had entered Jerusalem. Many of them would have been going to the temple on and off. So there were been many people who were not favorable to Rome here. So they couldn't go one way or the other, talk to people who were zealots, talk with people who were not zealots but were Pharisees or under the influence of. They couldn't do any of that. So they had to marvel at his answer, saying, "We've been had." They don't say that out loud, of course. They then, the Pharisees and Herodians, became silent. They just buttoned it up and walked away. In case you want to see more of what God has to say about authority, particularly human governmental authority, check out Romans chapter 13, 1 Timothy chapter 2, and 1 Peter chapter 2. We have given you the 1 Peter one. The other two were we hadn't given yet, as I recall. Well, yeah, 1 Timothy we may have. But again, the Romans 13, 1 Timothy 2, 1 Peter 2. Some commentator has said that people are God's coinage. Why? What did the Roman coin, have on it? The image of Caesar. What do people have? People have been created in God's image. So this guy said, we're God's coinage, we're his change. Next, the third group that's going to come to us next time to try again to trap Jesus with a question. Who are they? The Sadducees, the guys who ran the priestly show and the Sanhedrin, and who were the theological out of step with most Jews, Pharisees in particular. Let me translate that last sentence. The Sadducees were out of step with most Jews. The Sadducees were out of step with the Pharisees. The Sadducees, however, ran the priestly show, ran the Sanhedrin, in fact, had the best and largest influence in running the nation Israel. How did that happen? How did they get way off base from the Pharisees? Well, we'll talk about that next time. By the way, just how heavy a load was the poll tax? 1 denarius represented 1 day's work, right? The yearly income then would have been about 300 denarius if you worked 6 days a week, for example. 6 times 52 would be 312 denarius. So a denarius, as a head tax, as a poll tax, represent about 1/3 of 1% of the working man's income. How'd you like your income tax to be 1/3 of 1% and not 5%, 15%, 30%, 50%? 1/3 of 1%. Sounds good to me.